Hello, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 69th Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Judy Lobel, and I'm the Assistant Executive Director of the Jewish Community Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you on this Tuesday afternoon to hear about the novel Queen of Tuesday, a Lucille Ball Story by Darin Strauss. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the best new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. This year, although the rooms we are all sitting in may be different, the purpose remains. The book fair runs until December 9th, and we have an exceptional lineup of events planned. To see our full event schedule, learn about ways to support the Jewish Book Fair, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store where you can find Queen of Tuesday and plenty of other hand-selected books and gifts. Visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair, and it's on the screen right now. This year, in order to provide as much programming to the community as possible, we've made all of our events free of charge. So if you enjoy this event and other book fair events, please consider becoming a patron or donating to the book fair. You can do this either or both at our website listed below. We rely on our community to make this annual event possible, so we thank you in advance for becoming a part of the family. The book fair team would like to thank the Southfield Public Library for being a supporter of today's event. We have a really special event for you today, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions or offer comments in the YouTube comments section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. We expect a great discussion, so we will take as many questions as possible. While you're on the YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video or subscribe to this channel and click the reminder bell. That way you'll never miss any of our exciting events. I want to add that you can also forward, if you think this is a great discussion, you can forward that to your family and friends so that they can watch it later, as this program, as all of our book fair programs, will stay on the site. The focus of today's program is Queen of Tuesday, a Lucille Ball Story. We have with us the author of the book, Darin Strauss, as well as Bram Presser, who will moderate the discussion. The romance at the heart of Darin Strauss's novel begins with a daring conceit that the author's grandfather may have had an affair with Lucille Ball. She was one of the most powerful women in the history of Hollywood, was part of America's first high-profile interracial marriage, owned more movie sets than any movie studio, and almost single-handedly created the modern TV business. Strauss mixes fact and fiction, memoir and novel, to imagine the provocative story of a woman we thought we knew. Darin Strauss is the author of the best-selling novels Chang and Ang, The Real McCoy, and More Than It Hurts You, and the memoir Half a Life, the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. He has received the Guggenheim Fellowship, the American Library Association Award, and numerous other prizes. His works have been translated into 14 languages and published in 19 countries. He is currently the clinical professor of fiction in the graduate writing program at New York University. Australian author, comes to us from Australia right now. Bram Presser is formerly the frontman of punk band Yidcore. Presented as National Jewish Book Award winning fictionalized family memoir Book of Dirt, also available through our bookstore, at last year's book fair. Please join me in welcoming Darin and Bram. Hi.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
Judy, very kind of you. Thank you. And Bram, good to see you.
You too. This is pretty cool. Detroit, Melbourne, Australia. So Here we are. It's good to be back in Detroit, even if it's virtually. So Darin, firstly, just congratulations on the Queen of Tuesday. I really loved it. It's a great book. It was the perfect antidote for 2020. It was joyously fun to read. But it comes with real depth and substance. There's so much to it, and I'm very excited to be talking to you about it today.
Thank you, Bram. I appreciate that, and that's very kind of you. And I'm very excited to be talking with you. I was curious. The book is largely about Lucille Ball. Do you know her, being Australian? Is she?
No, okay, it was actually really interesting reading it from an Australian kind of perspective, because I suppose I'm certainly aware of her, and I know that she was a big deal. And my family is American, so I sort of have that. But she's the factors of time and also of distance make her quite remote for me. So it was very interesting reading it. But what was interesting was, as I read it, there were a lot of things that I did kind of recognize, and including references to episodes, as well as events, historical events. Now, you call it a Lucille Ball story, though, right? But I think, to me, it was this beautiful kind of act of devotion almost for your grandfather. And you say at one point, which is one of my favorite lines. There are a lot of my favorite lines in this book, but one of my favorite lines is, wouldn't it be a perfect gift to my grandfather if I could write that and have it be true? Which was referring to a happy ending for Lucille and your grandfather Isidore, but also I felt for the love story itself. But before we get to the love story, I'm just interested in knowing a little bit about the Isidore you knew, and your relationship with him.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I guess I should maybe tell the audience a little bit about what the book is. So, as you mentioned, it's my grandfather, who's Isidore Strauss, Jewish real estate guy in New York City in the 40s and 50s. It's his story, so it's sort of a family memoir. It's a sort of biography of Lucille Ball's golden period, and she really was, in a way that I don't know if people outside America would know, the most famous person in America in that time period. And so it's sort of how she got to be that way. And then it's the story of their passionate sexual affair. I don't know, I always do this when I say that part of the story, but yeah, and so that part is fictionalized. And my grandfather did meet Lucille Ball at a party thrown by Donald Trump's father, of all people, and that's the opening of the book. And I wanted really to write the story of my grandfather because I found him a fascinating guy. I mean, he did bad things in his life, and no one ever blamed him. And I was always sort of struck by the power of charm. I think he was very charming and beloved, and so people, including my grandmother, who he did really wrong, that they forgave him always.
But what was he like as you knew him?
He was very sweet and seemed like a very moral person, so my grandfather.
You were close though. Yeah.
What do you say?
You were close with him.
I was very close with him. Yeah. Closer with him than my grandmother. And then when he died, I realized I'd sort of given, like the rest of my family, I sort of gave my grandmother short shrift, because my grandfather became an alcoholic, and no one really knows why. And I think it's because he had affairs. But that's just a speculation. But so she became an alcoholic, and he left her. He waited till his father was dead, because it was an old world Jewish family, and he had to do what his father said. So the day his father died, he left my grandmother and moved in very soon thereafter with her best friend. And they lived in New York City, and she lived in the suburbs of New York. And so for the last 30 years of her life, she was a hermit, a drunken. Well, she stopped drinking near the end, but for most of the time I knew her, because she died when I was 31. She was a sad, broken figure, and he was living in New York City with his girlfriend, who was sort of like my step grandmother in a way.
Right. We'll get to your grandmother a bit later, because she I think is almost the unsung heroine of this book. But the idea, the conceit of this affair between your grandfather and Lucille Ball, which is really, it's audacious. It's kind of bonkers, right? At what point did it hit you? Like,
well, it's so interesting. I think bonkers is the right word for it. Thank you. No one's had the guts to say that to me before, but it's so true. It's a weird idea. But what happened was, I was had a dream, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I wrote it down. I said, "Oh, that's my next book," and I fell back to sleep, and I forgot what I'd written. So I grabbed the paper and said, "Oh, this is gonna be my next book," and it just said Lucille Ball and Papa Izzy, and I thought, "What the hell is that?" So I said, "Okay, maybe there's a story there." I dreamt they had an affair, and I did some research, and I found out they had actually been at a party thrown by Donald Trump's father, because he was a real estate guy.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, and I must have heard that somewhere. And he was having affairs at that time, so I sort of imagined that and she, was very unhappy in her marriage at that moment. So I imagined this affair for them because they had met. And I realized that well, the interesting thing about my grandfather too is that he had what I call an anti-talent. He was sort of the only person I've ever heard of who inherited a bunch of New York City high-rises and ended up broke. Like he was the worst businessman imaginable. You almost can't do that.
I can think of another one. I can think of another one now. But,
what do you say?
I can think of another one now.
But he's not quite broke, unfortunately. But so by the time I was born, all the money was gone. But he lived this high life in the 50s where he was rubbing elbows with Trump's dad, and this party where the book starts. The reason they were both there is that Trump Sr. bought all this beautiful historic real estate in Coney Island in Brooklyn and wanted to tear it down and make crappy housing, as he was wont to do. And so to avoid the scandal of destroying this landmark, he was very good at manipulating the press, like his son is. And so he had this glitzy party. He invited a bunch of real estate people, but more important, a bunch of celebrities. And at the stroke of midnight, all the celebrities threw a brick through this glass and steel cathedral, basically. And the New York Times took pictures, and that was the story. Not landmark destroyed, but glitzy party.
Yeah. It's a great scene. It's a fantastic opening, and I mean, I love. This is not a spoiler, I suppose, because it happens right at the beginning. That Lucille and your grandfather, steal a kiss, and Desi socks him one in the eye, which is I just thought great. But I mean, you must have known very early on that you were taking on a hugely audacious task. And how did that feel, knowing the reverence with which Lucille is kind of held in America, knowing that you would do something that was very chutzpahdik, really? How was that for you?
Well, yeah, I think it was sort of the reason it took me a very long time to write this book. I think it's because it was really complicated in a lot of ways. I'd written memoir and contemporary fiction and historical fiction, and I sort of said, I want to just sort of challenge myself and try to do all at once and see if I can make a book that takes advantage of all I've learned about writing in the last 20 years. And so it was much harder than I thought it was going to be to make it all work, because there's a storyline running through it that's me as a young man also. And that storyline was originally 300 pages. The book was actually 600 pages when I handed it in. It just didn't work. So I had to figure out a way to make it all work. And so telling the story of my grandfather was challenging because I loved him and I wanted to show him as a flawed person, but not a villain, And then taking this beloved figure and making her a human being and not an icon was also challenging. But I think, the most gratifying thing has been, I heard from a friend of Lucille Ball's who's still alive, who wrote me. And I was really anxious because I thought, maybe he won't like it. But he said he felt like he was talking to her when he read the book. So that was
that's cool.
Yeah,
that's
that was cool. And that was nice. But my grandfather, as I mentioned, so there's an affair and a broken marriage. And generally when, I was writing fiction in the past, it would be like, okay, why does this marriage break up? Well, I'll make one of the people in the marriage a jerk or boring or something. So, there's a reason to break it apart. But I had to say, no, these are my grandparents. They're real people. I wanted to do justice by them. So how do you take a story where you respect both people and they're both well-rounded characters and still show the marriage failing? So that was the big challenge,
Well, yeah. And you said that, it's a combination of, of memoir, of fiction, of auto fiction, of I think the one thing that I found really that I sort of loved was that I was never quite sure what was what in terms of what you had made up, what you would what had actually occurred, and so just wondering about how much you felt compelled to stick to facts. Actually, before, like, your research process. So there must have been a lot of research in this. So given that you had to learn so much about your grandparents and also about Lucille's life, how compelled you felt to stick to the facts and versus allowing kind of your imagination to run free?
Well, that's a great question. So I studied with an Australian writer, actually, to bring it back to this discussion. My one of my teachers was Peter Carey, who's an Australian novelist, and
he's run away from us, but
yeah.
we won't hold that against him.
But that's the funny thing. So he said when he writes about Australia, he puts a mistake in every time on purpose, not just to piss Australians off. And I realized, well, that means you can do anything, And he said, he said, when I was a student, you're writing a novel, you can. It's not a history book. You can take liberties. And then I also studied with E.L. Doctorow, great American historical novelist, and he said, when you're writing a novel, do the least amount of research you can get away with. And I said, well, that seemed kind of flip, but I think there's something to that. You're not writing history, you're writing fiction, and so the story is the key. It has to be an entertaining story. The characters have to be believable, and the facts can take a back seat. I mean, I think the key to that sentence is what you can get away with. I had to do a lot of research because so many people know Lucille. You want to be respectful to her. You want to tell her story in a way that won't piss off her fans and won't be wrong. I had to learn about the 1950s TV industry. I had to learn about real estate in the 50s. So there was a lot of research. But, the story took precedence. So I did change, like that party that Trump's father threw actually happened after the show went on the air. And I moved the date to make it more dramatic to right before. So that was when she was about to become famous. I do say, and I know that can be annoying to people too. So I do at the end have afterward where I say what was true and what wasn't true. But I think it was true for the most part, all the facts. The facts about Lucille and her career and her marriage were true, and the facts about my grandfather were true. It's just,
I have to say, there were some things that I may well be known to Americans that I had no idea. Like just that her brush with the House of Un-American HUAC.
That's moved to a better lighted place. But yes, so the lights go down in New York.
Let's take a stroll through this place.
Yeah. So she was
better bookshelf.
I actually wrote an article about that recently. She was a communist in the 30s. She was an avowed communist. She said she did it for her grandfather, but in fact, she signed a document saying I'm a communist. She voted for a communist in 1936 California election. So she was a real communist, and so that came back to haunt her when.
But it's interesting that she was sort of let go in a way that other celebrities were not. Like she, what was it about her that was that sort of managed to escape the McCarthy kind of wrath that other, very famous, very important people, didn't manage to get off in the same way.
Yeah, so that's right. So in the 50s, in the Red Scare, celebrities were being blacklisted, and then for far less. I mean, people who were being communist with very little evidence were blacklisted. And then there's this woman who signed a piece of paper saying, I am a communist. I think it was the nature of her fame. She was so beloved, so famous, that she was too big to fail, basically.
I think that's what I took from that scene. Like, to understand the magnitude of her fame, that I think was the single event that really kind of nailed it.
Well, there are two. One is that, and the other one is that her show was so popular that, and I write about this in the book, but it's not fiction, it's true. The reservoirs in Detroit, New York City, Boston, Chicago were all measured as going down when her show cut to commercial, because everyone in those cities was in the bathroom. Everyone thought it was totally true. And it was, Detroit was actually the first one to measure it. So I came across that can't be right. And so I did some research on that, and it was an article, I think, in the Detroit Free Press was the first place to note that, and then New York was I think then followed suit. So yeah. Crazy.
That's what I have to say. If I have to write a trivia question for a quiz, that's going to be my next one.
That's the game, right? When the whole country can believe itself.
Which show, was it? I Love Lucy, Friends, Seinfeld. Now, just back to this fact fiction divide. There's a line that I think is great that really throws the reader, which says, where you say, it's towards the end, a work of the imagination isn't the book I had to write. This is. Which kind of suggests to the reader that it's more fact than fiction. So just going to Lucille herself, who's the Lucille of your book, and to what extent does she differ from your understanding of Lucille, the real person, or are they the same person?
Good question. I mean, when you write a book, as the characters are sort of, well, you think of them as yourself in a way, but, I really thought of her as the Lucille and wanted to capture her. But, when you write a book, eventually she becomes your Lucille. So it's hard to know where one breaks off and one doesn't. That's why it was so gratifying. I want to find the book. The guy, that's right here somewhere. The guy who wrote a book about her called I Loved Lucille, and it was his friend who was Lucille, and so that's why it was so great for me when he said that he thought I captured her. And I think that's the reason I wrote the book, actually, because I think there's a different kind of truth you can get at. And Stephen King talked about this, why he wrote The Stand. He was saying, he'd seen something about a toxic spill and then decided to write The Stand because novels can get at things that nonfiction books sometimes can't.
Yeah.
So, I'd read a bunch of biographies about Lucille Ball in researching this book. Oh, here it is. This is the guy. I Loved Lucy. But, and she was a very private person. She didn't give anything away. So the biographies of her are actually quite unrevealing and don't give you any sense of what it was like to be her. So I thought, well, a fiction writer can do more with someone like that, because a biographer has to stick to what is verifiable. So we can tell you on October 1st, 1951, the show aired for the first time, but they can't tell you what's it like to be at the center of this incredible fame. So I thought, well, I can paradoxically give a more full portrait of what it was like to be her than an actual biography if I do my job right.
And what was that like inhabiting her mind or her experience? This book is kind of like a high wire act of daunting tasks. And I think, inhabiting her mind, because there's a lot of interior kind of monologue and thought kind of expression in the book. So what was it like taking that on?
Well, that was part of the big challenge. I mean, usually I've written books before in a year and a half or 2 years. This took me, 4.5 years, I think, because it was hard to get that voice right, to understand fame. You had to do research on fame. I actually knew some people who, I don't know that many famous people, but I was friendly with Carrie Fisher because she liked one of my earlier books. And so then I drew upon, her experience, because when I'd been around her we weren't super close, but I'd been around her a few times, and just that thing where everyone wants a piece of you, but you're also very lonely, I found really interesting. My few brushes with fame, people who are famous, I've found it just really fascinating. Another person I was friendly with who was famous was Philip Seymour Hoffman, and I saw, because I became friends with him in the mid-90s. He was very good friends with a good friend of mine. So again, we weren't super close, but I saw around him the people who were very close with him change, because they were mostly actors and they all wanted something from him. So the knock on famous people, I think, is that they change. they drop their friends because they become jerks, and I'm sure that's often true. But with Philip, I saw the people around him change, and I thought I wouldn't want to be friends with people who just kiss your ass all the time. So anyway, so I was just fascinated by Fame, and that was sort of my way into her.
Because I really felt that I knew her by the end, which is like a really great kind of experience. And I don't know whether the Lucille I knew is Lucille, but going by her friend's reaction, that perhaps I got to know Lucille. But what about your grandfather? What about your grandfather? What was it like writing him and inhabiting him? Because I imagine in some ways that was more challenging. Challenging
in a different way. I mean, less challenging because I knew him personally, so I could draw on that. But the challenge was to make him flawed. But I didn't want. I love him a lot, but I also wanted to show that he was a flawed person. So that was the challenge, I think. Another challenge, and I did an interview recently about this, where their interview couldn't get over the fact that I wrote a sex scene with my grandfather, and there is a sex scene in the book.
Yeah.
And it was weird.
Quite a raunchy one too. I should add. Like this is not a 1950s sex scene. This is a
it was real. Hopefully, it was weird. But I always tell my students, because as Judy mentioned, I teach at NYU, and I always tell my students, if you're going to tell a story, you have to go where it takes you and really go for it. Because if you're not going to be honest and really bare yourself, your innermost fears when you're telling the story, if that's required, then there's no reason to tell it. You have to really go for it all the way. So I was writing this romance, and I wanted it to be this great romance in the vein of like Love in the Time of Cholera, where it's like, is it love? Is it obsession?
Yeah,
hard to tell. And then I realized, I'm at this point. I've written myself into a corner. I have to write a sex scene, so I just did it.
If it makes you feel any better, I wrote one about my great grandmother. So,
that you taught me. Yeah.
So I people seem to have trouble getting over that when they ask me about the book as well. So there's something very odd about writing your grandparents having sex or great grandparents.
Well, there's a great Yiddish phrase, which is a family is doomed if a writer is born into it.
That's so true. What most surprised you about your grandfather as you were writing him?
That's a great question, Bram. I think I'd been angry at him about how my grandmother ended up, but then writing him, I've tried to get into his shoes, and I realized, okay, I have more sympathy for him. He was in a tough spot. He was desperately unhappy, and he had an alcoholic wife in a period where we weren't as good at dealing with addiction. And so I think he, in a way, did the best he could. And, everyone's flawed. I don't want to be judgmental. I'm sure there are things that I've done that people would look back on. I just hope not I hope my grandkids aren't writers.
Or at least not writing sex scenes about you, but yeah.
Or if they do, wildly exaggerate.
Yeah. I have to say though, like you keep referring to him as flawed, but I think at the end of the day, to me, he just came across as human, and I think that's the really one of the kind of great successes of this book is that this is a very well-rounded depiction of a real person, and he was very likable in spite of his flaws, because as you say, we all have them. Well, I only have a couple, but most people have them.
Thank you for being generous about the book, and also I think that's something I've learned in writing too. I remember reading this quote by Amy Hempel, where she said, when you're writing, remember a devil on the page, an angel to the reader. And I think that means, since we are all flawed, if you show a flawed character, we can sort of love that person. But if a character is perfect, we don't really relate to them, because none of us are perfect. And you think of like some of the most iconic recent TV characters and movie characters, they're so flawed. Like, what's the best TV show of the last 10 years? It's either The Sopranos or
The Wire,
Breaking Bad or Mad Men, and it's like those are really flawed people,
Yeah, Now, the other people, though, who I think really are very complex, I suppose, in this book are the spouses, Desi and Harriet, your grandmother. Now, as you say, this is a love story, but it's a love story with like clear collateral damage. And just wondering, because I don't think either Harriet or Desi come across. I don't know. I don't want to say particularly well. It just that I was just wondering to the extent that you needed to balance the wrongdoing, for want of a better term, of Lucille and Isidore with what they were faced with at home with Desi and Harriet. So yeah, how did you kind of go about that balance in a way that didn't try and just feel like you were justifying the affair?
Oh, that's a good question too. I mean, Desi was a real scoundrel. I actually wrote an article. So, I became sort of an accidental Lucille Ball expert. So I wrote an article for Vanity Fair about Desi Arnaz a couple months ago about how in the 1950s, at the height of their show, and you mentioned 1950s sex scenes, right? So 1950s were sort of a Puritan time compared to now. It was very prim. So in American TV, you couldn't show a married couple sleeping in the same bed. And Lucille Ball was the first pregnant body shown on American TV because that was thought to be indecent for some reason. So we're in a very proper time. And as that's happening, in the height of her fame, Lucille Ball's husband was caught by Hollywood Confidential magazine, or LA Confidential magazine, with two prostitutes, and that was made public. So he was cheating in ways that were hugely damaging to her, hugely embarrassing. Just like with the communist stuff, most stars would have been ruined by that, but she was just too beloved. But her husband being caught with two prostitutes at the same time would have been a huge scandal for anybody else. And so for her, I didn't feel bad. I actually wanted to give her an affair in a way to sort of give her revenge in a way, just because I loved her so much after doing all this research about how cool she was and there's a lot in the book about what a great pioneer she was for women, for people of color. I mean, she was white, obviously, but she was in the first famous interracial marriage. She was the first female mogul in Hollywood, so she was a very cool figure, and I really wanted to give her vengeance in a way. My grandmother's a different story. I mean, I don't see her as being that difficult to my grandfather in the book. I mean, they were just not necessarily a perfect match, but she was sort of blindsided by this. I've been watching The Crown on Netflix now, and Lady Di, is sort of wrong. I think the one thing they do well in that show is they show that Charles was desperately unhappy and in love with someone else, and not necessarily a villain, but certainly didn't treat Lady Diana very well, and Princess Diana. And so I feel like my grandmother's the same way. Like she was just in the wrong spot in the wrong time, And one of the saddest things I ever saw in my life was when my grandmother was dying. I was in the hospital the day before, and she was she was clearly on the way out. It was hospice. And she was talking to these nurses about her husband and her marriage as if she was still married. And it had always been like that. For 30 years, they'd been separated, but she didn't admit it to herself or anybody else that they weren't really still married because they never actually got divorced.
Yeah, I really loved her. I thought she was a really beautiful character in it. And I felt for her greatly. And there's actually there's a passage towards the end of the book, because I like that you were saying before that that there's this interspersal of your story, and as the book progresses, you become more and more part of the story. And towards the end, you say something really quite touching, which you said, "I wanted this book to chronicle my grandfather's secret love affair with Lucille Ball, and end with my efforts to get the movie they'd conceived conceived of together made. But my grandmother kept pulling the story to her, and stories have multiple strands. And this is something I found with my book as well. I set out to write my grandfather's story. I think I ended up writing my great-grandmother's story. And so, like, did you come to appreciate her almost as some kind of tragic heroine of your story?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when I was a kid, she was this angry drunk, and my grandfather was this charming guy. So I loved my grandfather and didn't like going to my grandmother's house. And it was only, after he died and after she stopped drinking at the very end, and I realized what a great woman she was and what a great loss it was. It's almost like the Faulkner story, A Rose for Emily. She was alone in this big house and just sad. And so, yeah, I feel like the great tragedy, the great unspoken tragedy of my family, because no one really talked about it until my book, is my grandmother. And it's pissed off a lot of my family too. I don't know if that happened with your book, but people didn't want this stuff aired really, but I wanted to get it out there.
Like how has this like changed the way you view her? Or is there, like, if you could speak to her now, what would you want to be able to tell her from what you've sort of learned through this?
Great question. I guess I would just say I'm sorry that you had to deal with all that. I'm sorry your life ended up the way it ended up. I mean, she, from all accounts, before I was born, she had a very happy life. I mean, she thought she was in a good marriage, and I guess it was good for a while. She'd grown up desperately poor and then lived a good life with my grandfather before he lost all his money. So they moved out to the suburbs, and my grandfather was one of the people who built Great Neck, Long Island, like this prototypical suburb. And so, had been very happy, had 4 kids, but then things went tragically wrong, and she drank, and I only saw her when she was a sad figure. So I would have liked to have asked her what happened, asked her what she really thought about everything, and just said, I'm sorry that it ended up that way. I actually would have liked to get her help, I mean, no one ever thought to take her to AA,
Well, yeah. Now, you also alluded to this earlier, that there were like 300 pages odd of Darin Strauss story that was cut, which again I greatly relate to, and there are these fragments of autofiction throughout. Basically, each chapter starts with, or each section starts with, a short passage about that involves you. And as I just said, you become a more central character towards the end of the book, and I thought that it was quite brilliantly woven. And that said, I sort of wanted to read more of the Darin Strauss stuff. So you've got my email address. Now, what do you feel was your role in the story?
Oh wow! So. Yeah, I think it was too much for me. And then there was a whole other storyline with like a mystery and romance with me, and it just didn't work. And I realized my role was just to sort of be the witness and to sort of tie them together, and to be the voice of the present and show, this ends up more sadly than you might think. And so I wanted to sort of give the echo of history through the story, and that was my role. Not to have a full-fledged plot line, which was just sort of ego,
Was it based around this? Was it based around this?
I was like, "You're wrong. I need it," and then I don't think you need it. So,
editors, it's so annoying when they're right,
Yeah, that's like a lot. That's like years of work that I had to throw out. It was not fun.
So, but what was very cool about the parts that remained were that I was never really sure whether the Darin Strauss on the page was as much a fictional construct as the other characters, whether I was further being drawn into some kind of narrative web to augment the conceit of the affair having actually happened. Can you tell us a bit about that aspect? And it was especially, I think, when I say confusing, I don't mean this in a bad way at all, but like intriguing maybe is the better word. Especially given that the Queen of Tuesday comes directly after a work of actual memoir, Half a Life, and that those who might have come to you through Half a Life will pick it up, and it might be a kind of almost discombobulating experience reading this uncertain autofiction. So yeah, could you just talk a bit about that aspect?
Yeah. I mean, the Darin character is a character in the book, so yeah, I changed some things. I had me being probably more clueless than I was, and going to this agent who actually is my agent and having her basically turn me down, which I thought was just kind of a funny in-joke from my agent. But yeah, it's me psychologically, but it's not quite me in terms of the fact.
Does the script exist?
Well, that's the big thing. So in the story, Lucille and my grandfather proposes writing a script with Lucille, and she's interested in the idea, and then he writes the outline, and nothing happens with it. And then the character named Darin finds it, and that was the total invention. My grandfather did want to become a writer, and I think that's why I'm a writer, because he wasn't allowed to. His immigrant father had a very old world view of business and said, "You're not going to be a poet, you're going to be a real estate guy," and forced him to take over the business, which I think is why he ran into the ground. He was not cut out for that. But so I thought, well, it'd be fun to come up with something he wrote. So that's also invented. There is no magic script.
I thought he might have written a script, quietly himself. So this is what the continual gift of this book that I will never know. Had I not spoken to you, I would have just thought that the script existed, even if Lucille didn't have involvement in it, that your grandfather had, because as you say, he wanted to be a writer, actually sat down and written something in the spare time he had when he wasn't having an affair with Lucille, because that bit wasn't true.
Well, the thing that was disappointing for me in researching was finding some of his writings, and he wasn't a good writer, which is sort of hard, because I had this dream that he was this great writer who was foiled by life, and that was sort of the romantic dream. But he wasn't.
You could get like a collection of his stories or something published posthumously, and he could.
Yeah, no, he wasn't very good. But maybe that was just because he never got the chance,
Yeah, that's sort of heartbreaking.
Yeah,
but. The other, because I'm just looking at the time. So another thing that really struck me is, I suppose one of the kind of many beating hearts of the book is America itself, right? During what some might think of as a golden era, but I suppose in retrospect sowed many of the seeds of today's problems. And you address things such as you've mentioned before, fame and celebrity, greed, self-centeredness, overdevelopment. And as you mentioned, it has a cameo at the beginning and numerous mentions thereafter of Fred Trump. So what were the challenges of writing this bygone era through the lens of what we know or the way we think now?
Oh, it's a great question, too. I mean, I started writing the book long ago enough that Trump wasn't president. So I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Fred Trump threw this party. And then it became more sort of thematically resonant about the flaws and difficulties of fame in America when Trump actually became president. But yeah, I think you don't want to stack the deck. You don't want to make a political book. You don't want to seem like you're smarter than the people then because you were born later. I feel like there's a tendency of people writing about the past to look down on those people and say, oh, they were so backward. I never would be like that, because I'm sure there's things that we're doing that people in the future will look down on. So, but you have to have I think an understanding of history too when you write a book like this. And so I did want to look at, as you say, the seeds of these things that are so important today. And so I guess the challenge was finding the balance between being sympathetic to everyone then and acknowledging that things have changed.
Yeah. What do you think what you learned about that era can really kind of teach us, moving forward? particularly on how, I don't know, we might recover from the current state, I suppose.
Well, great question again. I think that I really wanted the book to look at how warping fame is, because I actually think that in the book, my grandfather loved Lucille because she was famous in a way, and fame sort of, I think the character might have ended up much happier had he not met this woman, because he was sort of infused or infected by her glamour, and he felt like, how can I return to my normal life if I have this brush with this powerful figure? And I think, we're all sort of dealing with the warping aspects of fame in America now, because, not to tip my hand politically too much, but I don't think Trump had too many qualifications for the job other than he was famous. He never served in any government capacity before. He hadn't shown any great empathy for people. He hadn't shown any interest in policy or even success at business, really. He'd gone bankrupt 4 times. So,
it also shows those around, like, the people who swear by, who stand by famous people simply to like almost I'm loath to use the word infected in the current circumstances, but the way we're infected by fame, and that it envelops us, and we you'll want to think or do things that taken outside of that context, you would like kind of knock yourself on the head and say, what was I thinking?
Yeah, I remember when they were trying to figure out who's going to run in 2020, the Democrats were talking about Oprah.
Yeah.
I was like, God, I hope not. I have nothing against Oprah, and if she wanted to pick my book, I would tell her to run for president, But I just feel like we have to get away from that. We haven't had we need someone like the anti-expertise in this country is probably related to that.
Yeah.
Warping by fame, like fame above all, including expertise, So I'd much rather have someone with the skill than the fame.
Well, you told me. Now, so we have a question here. How did writing the book change the relationship you have with your grandfather in your mind?
Well, I think that, touching on that a little bit, I felt closer to him finishing it, because, I had this anger toward him, because I felt like I had been duped by him in a way, because I was so much closer with him than my grandmother. And then when he died and I saw how sad my grandmother's life was, I felt like he could have maybe been a better, even after he left her, he could have maybe tried to get her help or something. But then living with him for years, I felt like, okay, I understand this person and I love him for his flaws. He was my grandfather and great to me in a lot of ways, never was cross with me or anything, so I felt like I understood him better, but also just felt closer to him than I had, both my grandparents, than I had in years.
Do you feel you needed to forgive him? And if you did, have you?
Yes and yes. Yeah. I feel like I needed to, and I feel like I have.
And now you say, have you heard it all from Lucille's family or just the friend?
Just the friend. I'd heard that someone told me that Lucille's daughter was reading it, and I never. That was recent, so I don't know if that's true or what she's thinking of it. I don't expect to hear from her. It's a book about her father's infidelity and her mother's imagined infidelity.
Well, and I was going to say, if Desi Jr. reads it, he's gonna maybe bristle a bit through a couple of chapters.
Well, I had to there was the only thing the lawyers at Random House asked me to change was I talked about his drug addiction, and they said, "Can you tone that down a bit? We don't want to be sued by a living person." But that was the only thing they asked me to change. Everything else I was able to keep as is, because it's fiction, so I could say what I wanted to say.
Right. Now, I should also just say, if anyone watching does have questions, to put them in the comment section, because we're nearing time, and I'm sure Darin would like to take any of your questions if you have.
Yes.
Now,
I have to teach a 5 o'clock class, so I have to leave at 4:59.
that's good. Well, you have 9 minutes to get your questions in.
9 minutes and 30
I
seconds.
feel like we're at the examiner's table now.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is, So I think what's also really interesting about this book is you've essentially created a new family myth, right? And so, like, given the importance of myths in family life, and I know you talk about. I think it's in the afterword. You talk about this story about your other grandfather or your great grandfather who was who played baseball for the Brooklyn Kings, was it? And it turns out that it's not true. And I had a similar experience as well. So, like, what do you think the role of myth is in shaping families, and how did that weigh on you in writing what may well become 3 generations down the line family myth within your family?
Yeah, I had to think about that. I mean, I don't want to be a purveyor of fake news, to use like the I want to stand up for the right of fiction writers to make up stories, though. So I think as long as I say it's fiction, that I feel like it's morally okay. But I did feel like we've been talking about, a real responsibility to get my grandfather right, because he's an unknown figure now. If I'm lucky, a lot of people will know him as this person he wasn't. So you have to really tread carefully. But Saul Bellow said to one of his family members who wanted to write about him, he said, the tools are all laid out before you on the ground. I'm strong enough to pick them up. If you were strong enough to pick them up, go for it. So I feel like, if someone in my family wanted to write that story differently, then they're welcome to do it.
So what did you said that you did piss off some of your family with this. What's the general reaction been from your family?
They've liked it. My father said it was very hard to read because there's a sex scene with his dad, and then there's a death scene. I don't want to give too much away, where people in his family die. So he said it was very hard. But again, it was gratifying because he felt like I really captured his father. So you never know if you're going to pull it off. So that, like with the person who liked Lucille in the book, the fact that my family has said, "Oh yeah, that's Papa Izzy," is gratifying. I guess people didn't mind the book. They just didn't want me to talk about my grandmother being an alcoholic and my grandfather having an affair. Most of the people who knew them are dead. My grandmother's sister is alive. She's 96, and so 98. So she's the one I was curious about. But she's, I think it's pretty kind to my grandmother, so she liked it.
It's funny because I had the same experience in terms of the only things that family took exception to, and it was only one person, was that my great grandfather, who was a drunken gambler, was portrayed as a drunken gambler. And it's funny that people want their families to be shown in the or made famous or whatever, however you want to term it. But so long as you don't point out the actual flaw,
Right. You feel like you grew closer with your grandfather, or did you feel angry at him, or how did you feel?
Yeah, so I actually felt that. I kind of like you. I was incredibly close with him. He died when I was 20, and I found in writing the book that I got to understand him a lot better and got to know him a lot better. And there wasn't reason in a similar way for me to have ever been angry with him, but I understood his kind of grief, I suppose, and I kind of came out of it wishing that I was able to explain to him that, having researched all the things that had happened, the things that he blamed himself for just weren't his fault, and I just wish I could have alleviated his pain in that way. But I think it is a transformative experience, isn't it? Right, really saying I am gonna, and I took 8 years, spend a significant amount of time committing to knowing and understanding and reimagining my family.
Yeah.
And I feel, and I'm wondering if you feel the same, that I feel there's a certain sense of being at peace with my ancestors, I suppose, for having done it.
Well, I think that's maybe this is a good place to go out on, in a way. Like, that is, in a way, it's a tribute. Like, even in their flaws, you're immortalizing your grandfather and your great grandmother. Even in his flaws, I'm telling my grandfather's story in the book. He wanted to be a writer, and he's, thanks to this book, he's been mentioned in the New York Times and the Washington Post and places like that. And if you do it respectfully and honestly, maybe it's a tribute to them. It's a memorial.
Yeah, and that you can pass that on to your kids, and your kids can pass it on to their kids, and they have, they will be remembered long into the future in a way that, I don't know who my great grandparents are.
Except my kids said they'll never read any of my books, but yeah.
They'll change. They're young. They'll change. Anyway, you're right. I think we better call it time there. Just if you've got to get to your class, you have 4 minutes. Don't want to be late. But, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to the JCC of Metro Detroit. You can get Darin's book, The Queen of Tuesday, at in my head. I can't stop saying Tuesdays in my head. The Queen of Tuesday at the JCC bookstore. And thank you for joining us, and thank you. Hi, Judy. Judy's back.
Thank you so much, Darin and Bram, for being with us and for such an interesting discussion. Thank you to everyone who is here watching with us. And remember, if you enjoyed it, you can always click the link from the YouTube and be able to pass it on to family and friends. Our next exciting event is today at 7 p.m. Unacceptable, Privilege, Deceit, and the Making of the College Admissions Scandal by Jennifer Levitz and Melissa Korn. And as I said, that'll be at 7 o'clock tonight. So I hope you'll join us. And remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/book fair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. Thank you.